Hi, so here is a video overview of the main things to think about in Chapter 8. Chapter 8 covers the Northern Renaissance, which is, it overlaps with Chapter 7, where we talked more about the Italian Renaissance. And when we talked about the Italian Renaissance in Chapter 7, we ended saying that in the latter part of the Italian Renaissance, Italy did not have their own style as much anymore. They adapted the styles of the different northern countries in Europe. So we're going to see the fashions that they adopted in Italy as well today. So as far as political and economic, we have to break these up into different countries since we are looking at things that are going on in Spain, France, and England all at the same time. So France was ruled by Ferdinand and Isabella, and they did fund Columbus's voyage to discover more countries. He did find gold and made Spain very rich. Charles V took the throne after them, and he was considered the Holy Roman Emperor. His goal was to establish that Roman Empire again, where he ruled most of Europe and the Middle East. He was only 19, and he did have a power over a lot of land, but he did spend a lot of money on wars with other countries. In England, it was ruled by the Tudor monarchs of the time, so they were a family lineage that took power from one another throughout these years. Queen Elizabeth, fashion-wise, was the most iconic. She was a fashion icon. She had red hair, which was very different for the time, and it was very curly and big, and she wore it kind of unruly in a way. And so a lot of the hairstyles were big and curly and crazy at the time, and she really did help set fashion trends. In France, there was a civil war going on between Protestant and Catholic families. So that was taking a lot of time going on in France. Henry IV did take over in the late 1500s, and he signed the Edict of Nantes, which ended the religious feuds. He also had a big influence on the textile industry, and France became really good at making fine linens and silks. Another notable thing in France was that Catherine de' Medici married Henry II, and she came from Italy. Whenever a woman married into a royal family, they would bring with them their ladies in waiting or their friends. They brought their fashions. Sometimes they brought their tailors, seamstresses, and she brought her perfume makers with her. France is known as the biggest perfume industry in the world still. And it's interesting that she actually brought the perfume industry with her from Italy, and then France became well known for it. As far as social, this is very related to what we just talked about. Royal families married people from other countries. This was usually an arranged marriage, and it was to create alliances and powers. And as we just noted, Catherine de' Medici did establish the French perfume industry when she came from Italy. They also brought books with them, and it really it helped with the spread of information and the spread of fashion from country to country. There were some new technologies at this time. They did create a spinning wheel with a treadle and a bobbin, so it made spinning faster and easier. They also learned how to knit. We have talked about fabrics this whole time, and they were all woven. Woven fabric does not stretch unless it stretches on the bias, and it is not quite as comfortable to wear. So when knitting was invented, first hand knitting was invented in the 1400s, and then by the 1500s, a knitting machine was made for stockings. We've talked about the stockings or the hose that people are wearing, and they would have been made out of a woven material. But once knitting was invented, they were able to make stockings out of knit material, and that's more like what we would wear today for leggings, for pantyhose, tights, all t-shirts, undergarments. A lot of those are knit, and we know that that's more stretchy, and it's also more comfortable. So the invention of knitting, especially for stockings or hose, was very important, and it made them fit more closely to the skin and more comfortable to wear. Also notably, Queen Elizabeth did not want to hurt the hand knitters and put them out of business, so she would not patent it in England, and France patented it and became the knitting capital of Europe. There were also more decorative techniques invented during this time. Spanish work was very popular for a while during when Spanish styles dominated Europe style. That is this black embroidery on sort of a white or cream colored fabric. That is called Spanish work. And it was very popular for a few years on fashion, as we will see later. They also started to invent lace. So the Italian cutwork and the filet or laces were sort of the forerunners to lace. They were put onto a net background and then they would cut the net background away. But eventually lace itself was invented. There were a couple different ways of making it, but lace being invented was very popular. It was a whole new way of making a sort of fabric, and it's still seen as sort of a fancy fabric. And so it was worn, we'll see it worn by a lot of wealthy people and leaders. This is a picture of Queen Elizabeth, and it just shows, excuse me, it shows the Spanish black work on the sleeves of her dress. We do need to note here that fashion starts changing much more quickly. So while we're only covering 100 years, we see three distinct changes in style. And so we will go through those changes for both men and women. So for men in the first stage, it was more of a transition from the late Middle Ages. In the second phase, we see wider breeches with slashing and painting. And then in the third phase, we see a more narrow top where the doublet is with wider hips. So the first period for men was 1500 to 1515. They were still wearing the shirt underneath with the doublet over top. In England, they called a doublet a paddock, and they wore their doublets in England with a V-neck in the front. This peach-colored material in the middle is called the stomacher. So the doublet with the low V-neck was usually more popular in Europe, but it was also filled with this piece of fabric here to add more interest and color. So that is the stomacher, and anytime you see a V in a garment filled with other fabric, we're going to call that a stomacher. The stomacher we will see repeated over and over, mostly in women's wear from here on out. On the bottom or over the doublet, they would wear a jacket. And then on the bottom, they were wearing something, it was a kind of a skirt that was called a base. The base was actually originated as a military item, and then it became worn by civilians. Over all of that, they would wear a gown or a robe. So this shows the difference. So things, they were kind of the same items, but they were different from country to country. So this would be in France, and this would be England. So you can see in France, they didn't wear the base or the skirt that was attached at the bottom. They were just wearing the hose attached to the doublet and then the codpiece still. This is another picture of a base. So this shows you really well the skirt-like garment that the base was. And this shows the long robes that would go over top. For women, we also go through three phases. The times are a little different for women, but at first there was a transition from the Middle Ages and then Spanish influence. And then we go to a different, a hoop skirt at the bottom. So we'll see really different shapes in women's garments. So this is the second phase with it's the Spanish, so it's more of a bell shape flaring out this way. And then we go to the wheel farthingale, where we have much more of a emphasis on the hips, and then it kind of flows down to the bottom. So the phase one for women, really, it was very similar to what we saw in chapter 7. They wore a chemise underneath everything with a gown over top of it, and then another gown or dress over top of that. So in this picture, you can see the undergown here at this blue area. And then this is the overgown, the more gold colored. And it had a big train on it that a lot of times would be sort of gathered in the back. Also, you can note the big sleeves with big cuffs on them. And these were actually fur. So that would have shown that you were pretty wealthy because your decorative lining on your cuffs could be fur. As far as headdresses, adult women covered their hair to be modest, and that was what was acceptable. They did wear something called a coif, and basically it was a piece of fabric that was folded and then arranged over the head. Here are some more pictures. A lot of these women are most of them are either married to royalty or they were mistresses of kings. Okay, so the second period for men, we start to see that the garments are more full they're more full in general. We start to see two new techniques, which is slashing and painting. So slashing is where they cut holes in the outer fabric. The goal of this was actually just to show that your underneath garment was fancy. It also helped with movement because, again, it was kind of hard to move your arms and things when you had such tight clothing on. So let's look at this. This shows slashing very well. So this is a doublet with slashing in the sleeves. It's really just cuts in the sleeves pretty much. And then as you can see in this picture, the slashes here, the undershirt or the chemise is showing through those slashes. So this is King Henry, and he would have had a very nice, probably silk undershirt, and he wanted to show that off. The painting is shown here. So painting is where there's actual strips of fabric that are sewn together at the top, and then you can see a different fabric through the where the painting is not going on. So the painting was another way to allow for more movement and not have stuff that was restricting, but it was also a way to add decoration and show your underneath garment as well. So painting would sort of be, it was actually fabric, but it would kind of be like putting a bunch of ribbons on to make the outfit. So with this, so we see on top, they still have the doublet. And then on the bottom, they would wear what were called upper stocks, and we start to call these breeches. So this part up here would be the upper stocks or breeches, and these would also be considered breeches because they cover the top part of the leg or the thigh. And then down below, they have the nether stocks, which these are just the stockings that cover the bottom part of the leg. Most likely during this time, these would have been knit. So they are fitting a little bit more closely to the leg and they would be a little bit more comfortable. Over top all of this, they would still maybe wear a gown or a robe as well. So in England, the shoulders of the doublet got wider. So the shoulders were wider, and in many times the lower part would be more slim. So this is just showing in different parts of Europe, they kind of wore things differently. So in England, they were more likely to have the base or the more full breeches. In Spain and Italy, they were more likely to have the more fitted upper stocks and then the more fitted lower stocks as well. So it wasn't as full on the bottom. Okay, the second time period for women is when they had Spanish influence. So we see the vertigale become a big part of the women's garment. The vertigale is this. It's an underslip that was made with whalebone or steel, and it was hoops that were arranged to get smaller to larger, and they were held together with usually a linen strip here. So they were worn underneath the skirts or the gowns, and it created this very much V or bell shape. So the vertigale is on your pest sheet, and anything that is used to shape the body or used as a shaping garment is going to be considered technology when it is new. So this was a new garment, a new technology of garment that was able to shape the bottom part of the outfit or the gown, the dress. And so it was a big technology at the time. At this time, the sleeves were pretty narrow at the shoulder, and then they got big towards the cuffs. Sometimes they were detachable so they could switch them out, and sometimes women's sleeves also had slashing or painting on them. Also at this time, women would carry a pomander. So a pomander was a kind of a accessory. It was a metal ball on a chain, and they would hold perfume in it. So sort of like potpourri, dried flowers and things. The goal of this was to act as perfume. It was to keep people, it was kind of to cover up odor. They didn't have a lot of outfits. They didn't take a shower a lot. They didn't wash their clothes a lot. So people were kind of smelly. So it was to cover up your own odor, or if you were around someone that was particularly smelly, you could also take your pomander and hold it to your own nose. Some of them also had medicinal herbs in them that they thought if you smelled them would keep you from getting sick. So here is showing some different people in the Spanish Vertigale type outfit, and here are some more pomanders. We start to see a lot more undergarments for women during this time period, and they're used for shaping. So not only are we seeing the lower garment shaping, which the vertigale, which we've already talked about, and we will talk about the bum roll and the wheel farthingale in a minute, but we start to see shaping for the upper part of the body as well. So we start to see stays, which are stays and corsets are very much related. Stays are just not quite as shaping as a corset. A stay is this, where it is kind of holding the body in with, it's got glue and it's a heavier fabric, but the corset actually ties to cinch in the waist, where the stays is more of just a, it's just kind of holding things in, but not actually pulling them to alter the shape too much. So until the 1530s, undergarments were pretty much the chemise, and they were really just to protect skin from your clothing and to absorb perspiration. But now the undergarments are starting to actually shape and support and change the shape of the body. So these are all new technologies that are developed. This is just showing what the styles look like again in the second period for women. Sometimes there was also an overdress called a ropa. The robe now gets its name from the ropa. So it was just something that you could wear over all of your dresses. It was usually less fitted and more comfortable. It would be worn around the home or around only other females, but not to a big event or party. During this time, Germany had its own style of dress as well. It was just, they never adapted the Spanish vertigale like other parts of the country did. Okay, the third period for men, this is from 1550 to 1600, and we start to see more narrow shoulders and more broad bottom at this time. So we are seeing that the doublet is completely covering the shirt now, and breeches have now taken over the stockings and the upper stocks. Now we are calling these breeches, and they are a separate garment that's worn with stockings. That's a separate garment on the bottom half of the leg. So breeches are kind of like shorts. We still don't have pants yet, but breeches are what we would kind of say are shorts now. There were different types of breeches depending on where you lived in Europe and what the occasion was. So sometimes they were really tight. Sometimes they were wide at the top and tapered to the knee. And then the trunk hose were one of the most popular, and these were what the royalty in England tended to wear mostly. And they were really padded. They would actually put padding inside of them. They ended at the hip or right above the knee, and they were really big and pumpkin shaped. They were also paned. You can see here that they have strips of fabric making up these breeches. So they were created with panes. They wore these they kept their hosiery up at this time with garters, so they would tie them up. And then they also had something called the canyon. The canyon is this, it's the extension of the trunk hose. So it was sort of a third garment that was worn between where the trunk hose ended and where the stockings began. And it really kind of helped to hold everything up and hold your stockings up from falling down. During this time, there was a shape of the doublet that was popular called the Peascod belly. The Peascod belly you can see right here, and it's a little bit padded. It is padded, and it sort of goes down in a V shape. Peascod is actually the word for peacock, so they named this after a peacock's belly. And if you think about a bird's stomach or bird's breast, it is sort of sticks out and it's kind of pointed at the bottom. And that's where this got its name. They would stuff the Peascod belly and the trunk hose with what was called bombast. So bombast is basically stuffing, and they used, now when we stuff a pillow, we typically use a polyester fiberfill or something. Well, they didn't have that then. So they would kind of just use whatever fibers they could find. They would use wool, horsehair, hay, anything they could find, and they would fill it in and stuff the trunk hose and the Peascod belly so it would be really full and big. There were also some decorative things. Peccadills were one of them that I think they show better on the next slide, so I will point them out there. And then we have the ruff. The ruff is a stiff collar that was a separate piece from the shirt. Usually this was made out of lace. Remember, lace was invented, lace was new, and so it was used to make this standing collar that was worn by royalty and wealthy people. So the ruff was a separate collar. It was made out of lace and it was stiff and it would go up around the neck. The link up to the video here is actually from the movie Elizabeth, and it shows just the costuming in there is pretty accurate, and it shows people wearing the doublet and the Peascod belly and all of those things. So you can see here, most of these men have the trunk hose on because they're more full. And then they have the canyons, which is this separate little piece here. This person does not have canyons on. They just have trunk hose and hose at the bottom. They mostly all have a Peascod belly. Some are bigger than others. And then we can definitely, in these pictures, see the ruff more dominantly. You can also see the painting on these trunk hose a lot better. These right here are the peccadills. So the peccadills were added on edges of garments. They could be on sleeves, on the bottom of the doublet, and it's just these sort of little square, it's just a decoration, really. It had no other purpose. This just shows how the trunk hose might vary from country to country, but they did this would be Venice, so Italy, Spain, and then France. So they are all wearing a form of trunk hose, a doublet, most have a Peascod belly, and then a ruff. This again shows the different types of trunk hose. So the Venetian breeches, these are the ones that were full at the top and tapered to the knee. These are very short trunk hose, that they're just this little piece right here. These are kind of just regular trunk hose. There were some specific accessories at this time. This popular shoe style was called a duckbill. So the shoes, instead of having a pointy toe, they had a very squared off toe that looked like the bill of a duck. That's why they were called duckbills. So those were the shoes that were popular. And they also started having mules, which are backless shoes. Those are still popular now, and they're still called mules. They also started to get some laces on their shoes. That some shoes had a tongue and actual laces, which they called latchets. So latchets were the first shoelaces. There were lots of different hats worn, and most of them had feathers and different things that made them fancier. And men also carried kind of a purse or pocket type of thing that would carry things they needed, handkerchiefs, and many of them wore gloves. Okay, so for women, the last phase is 1575 to 1600. This is also called the Elizabethan era because this is the time that Queen Elizabeth was very influential. She was influential in the second period as well, but she was very influential here as French style took over. So the big changes in the women's garment, you can see they look a lot different. One of the big changes was the switch from the vertigale to the wheel farthingale. So the wheel farthingale was actually this. So it was very big at the top, almost like putting a wheel around your waist with spokes. And then it just fell from that area down to the bottom. And it created this very, so there was a very broad top line, and then it went straight down to the floor. Underneath the wheel farthingale, they would wear what was called a bum roll. So this is basically just a pillow that was tied around the waist. You can see it underneath here. And its goal was to support the wheel farthingale. It was kind of hard to keep this wheel up at your waist. So they added the bum roll so it would have something to sort of sit on. The sleeves also got very wide and full at this time, so you can see the very full sleeves. The stomacher, this part is, we talked about the stomacher on the men's doublet earlier, but the women's stomacher is this part right here. So the corset had an extra extension added onto it called the stomacher. At this time, the stomacher extended way down and it was in a V shape. So pretty much a woman would not be able to bend over because they would have all of this whalebone or steel in their corset extending all the way down into their hips. The women's ruffs, they also wore ruffs. They looked a little different than men's, but they were lace and they were stiffened and they came up around the neck. So you can see the ruffs here. And then there was another item called the conch. The conch is this sheer veil. You can see it. It's kind of got a wire structure going around it, and it's filled with a fine net fabric. It's also, so here you can see the conch, the wire structure is here. It's actually got lace around the edges, and then it's filled with this net fabric. So really they can't figure out that the conch had any meaning except that it was fancy. And they thought in France it might have been worn by widows, but in England it was just decorative. So I'm going to go back to Queen Elizabeth's picture. You can see her ruff, her conch. Hers, it looks like, has pearls around the edges. And then the stomacher for her goes way down here. So imagine trying to bend over. Here's another clip from the movie Elizabeth that shows you the ruff. This is the conch, and then you can see the deep V stomacher. Here are some more pictures. This is Spanish. So in Spain, they really didn't adapt to the wheel farthingale. They sort of stuck with the more subdued Spanish style of dress, and they never really got to the whole big wheel farthingale. This is a picture from a party in a castle, and you can see the wheels on the women's dresses. You can see the ruffs. You can see the ruffs on the men. You can see the peas-cod belly over here. So it just kind of shows what they were wearing. Here are some more pictures from the time period. As far as jewelry and cosmetics, women wore quite a bit of jewelry at this time. They also put mercury salts on their face to make their complexion more white. We probably know that mercury is not good for you. So it would actually eat away their face. It would cause them to die prematurely. So it was not good for them at all. They also used red coloring on their lips and their cheeks. So they were wearing some makeup. When they were there, they wanted to protect their white complexion so badly that they would wear masks when they were outside to shelter their face from the sun. They had purses and they had feather fans that were made of either fabric or feathers. These are children. So children dressed just like adults when they were wealthy. At the time they were 5 or 6. So girls would put on corsets when they were 5 or 6, and they would wear the farthingale and the bum roll and everything. Boys would also, they would wear the doublet, the peascod belly, the stuffed trunk hose, the whole thing. So there really wasn't such thing as relaxing children's clothing at this time. Some modern influences, we see some reference to the farthingales and the vertigales in these outfits. This is actually Alexander McQueen based a lot of his collections off of the Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance. And this is Valentino from fall 2016, where you can see ruffs as an influence there. And that is it. So hopefully you are able to answer all of your pest items from this. Thanks. Bye.